5,000 years ago, a man looked at the Nile and decided he was no longer content with being a king. He wanted to be a god. To achieve this, he didn't just conquer land, he conquered the human soul, rewriting the rules of reality in a way that would echo for 5 millennia. This is not the story of a nation being born. This is the story of how humanity was taught to bow before a living sun and the terrifying price that was paid in the shadows of the First Dynasty. The crown of this god was forged not from celestial gold, but in the absolute silence of 1,000 rivals who vanished into the shifting desert sands. Long before the pyramids cast their long shadows over the Giza Plateau, there was no Egypt, only a fractured valley of shadow and dust. The world as we know it, the concept of a nation, the authority of a state, the very idea of a ruler who transcends humanity, was born from a singular, overwhelming act of will. Some call it the dawn of civilization. Others, looking closer at the fragmented tablets and broken stones of the First Dynasty, see something far more unsettling. They see the moment a man decided that being a king was not enough, and that to rule the earth, he first had to claim the heavens. For centuries, the Nile was a fractured artery. To the south, the rugged highlands of Upper Egypt worshipped the falcon. To the north, the lush marshes of the delta bowed to different spirits. They were worlds apart, separated by more than just geography. They were separated by the belief that no one man could ever hold the river in his hand. But history is often written by those who refuse to accept the impossible. Beneath the scorched earth of Abydos, archaeologists have whispered about a figure known only by a symbol, the scorpion. He was a precursor, a shadow moving through the pre-dynastic gloom, testing the boundaries of what a human being could command. Yet it was his successor who would truly shatter the old world to build a new one. This figure emerged not as a diplomat, but as a force of nature. He understood that power is not just about the control of resources, but the control of the narrative. To unite the river, he had to become the river. To unite the people, he had to become their destiny. His name was Narmer, or perhaps Menes, or perhaps he was a composite of many men whose names have been erased by time. Regardless of the name, the entity that emerged from the south carried a singular vision, the unification. It is often depicted in history books as a noble merging of two cultures, a marriage of the white crown and the red crown. But the artifacts tell a darker story. The Narmer Palette, a slab of dark silt stone, does not show a diplomatic treaty. It shows a giant among men, his arm raised in a gesture of finality, while his enemies lie beneath his feet, their spirits already departing for the western horizon. This was the birth of the Black Land, and it was baptized in a ceremony of absolute submission. The imagery is brutal, a direct message carved in stone for eternity. There is only one sun, and there is only one king. The enemies shown on the palette are not just defeated soldiers, they are the remnants of an old world that had to be systematically dismantled. To understand the shift that occurred during this era, one must look past the gold and the monuments. This was the moment the living god was invented. Before Narmer, leaders were chieftains, elders, or perhaps divinely inspired warriors. After Narmer, the ruler was the sun itself made flesh. This was a psychological revolution. By claiming to be Horus, the falcon who looks down from the heights of the cosmos, the first pharaoh moved himself beyond the reach of human judgment. You cannot argue with the rising sun. You cannot rebel against the flood. By weaving his identity into the fabric of the universe, Narmer ensured that to challenge the king was to challenge reality itself. This wasn't just politics. It was the ultimate form of gaslighting an entire population into believing that their survival depended entirely on the heartbeat of a single individual. This transformation required more than just words. It required a display of power that would haunt the collective memory of the Nile for eternity. In the early days of the First Dynasty, the transition from this life to the next was not a solitary journey. When a pharaoh passed into the beyond, he did not go alone. Beneath the desert floor at Abydos, researchers have found rows upon rows of humble graves surrounding the royal tombs. These were not the graves of family members who died of old age. They were the resting places of court officials, servants, and artisans, young men and women in the prime of their lives. There is a chilling order to these burials. They were laid out simultaneously, suggesting a ritual event of staggering proportions. There are no signs of struggle, no marks of trauma on the bone, leading some to hypothesize a quiet, systematic departure, perhaps a draft of something that brought a final heavy sleep. The implication is profound. The pharaoh's power was so absolute that his subjects accepted their own end as a mere footnote to his eternal journey. They were tools to be used in this world and the next, extensions of a singular divine will. This was the price of the Black Land's long-term stability. The state was not a collection of people. It was the body of the God King. If the God King required his servants to walk into the dark with him, they did so, timeless without a fight. This level of devotion is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. Yet it was the foundation upon which the greatest civilization of antiquity was built. It was a contract signed in the shadow of the tomb, a promise of order in exchange for the total surrender of the self. As the First Dynasty consolidated its grip, the landscape began to change. The wild, unpredictable marshes were drained and ordered into a grid of production. The Black Land, so named for the rich silt left by the receding Nile, became the engine of an empire. But this was not just an agricultural feat, it was a cosmic one. The pharaoh took credit for the flood itself. He stood on the banks and commanded the waters to rise, and when they did, his divinity was confirmed. It was a perfect system of control. If the harvest was good, it was the pharaoh's blessing. If the harvest failed, it was because the people's devotion had wavered, requiring even greater offerings to restore the ma'at, the cosmic balance. Ma'at is a term often translated as truth or justice, but in the context of the early pharaohs, it was something more rigid. It was the absence of chaos. To maintain ma'at, the pharaoh was permitted to do anything. Violence was not seen as a sin, but as a cleansing force, a necessary tool to keep the primordial waters of chaos from drowning the world. This philosophy allowed for a level of centralized authority previously unseen in human history. The individual disappeared. In his place rose the monument. The massive mud brick structures known as mastabas began to rise, the precursors to the pyramids acting as anchors that tethered the soul of the king to the soil of Egypt forever. These structures were not just tombs. They were territorial markers of a god who refused to leave, even after death. The mystery of Narmer's identity continues to provoke debate among those who study the fragments of the past. Was he a conqueror from the deep south, driven by a religious fervor to unite the world under the falcon's wings? Or was he the result of a long, creeping shadow of influence that slowly strangled the independence of the northern tribes? Some suggest that the unification was not a single event, but a centuries-long process of ritualized dominance, culminating in the crowning of a man who finally had the audacity to call himself a deity. The evidence is scattered in the broken pottery of Tarkhan and the silent corridors of the tombs at Saqqara, suggesting a world where life was cheap, but the image of the king was everything. Every shard of history from this period feels heavy with the weight of an iron-fisted transition. Consider the psychological weight of living in such a society. Every brick you lay, every grain of wheat you harvest, every breath you take is dedicated to the maintenance of a man who claims to be the reason the stars move in the sky. It is the ultimate social contract, signed in the shadow of the mace head. You are provided with order, with bread, and with a place in a cosmic hierarchy, but in exchange, you surrender your autonomy. The birth of Egypt was the birth of the first true megamachine, a system where human beings were the cogs, and the Pharaoh was the operator. This megamachine didn't just build walls, it built a mindset of eternal servitude that would persist for 3,000 years. The rituals of the First Dynasty were designed to reinforce this. The Sed festival, a jubilant yet high-stakes ceremony, required the king to prove his physical vitality. He would run a ritual course demonstrating that the god was still strong enough to hold the world together. If the king was weak, the world was weak. This created a cycle of perpetual performance. The pharaoh was trapped in his own divinity, a prisoner of the very myth he had created to rule. He had to be perfect, he had to be eternal, and he had to be terrifying. To show any sign of human frailty was to invite the return of the chaos he had supposedly conquered. The mask of the pharaoh was never allowed to slip, lest the entire illusion of the state collapse. As we look back at the dawn of the gods, we must ask ourselves what was truly born in the mud of the Nile 5,000 years ago. Was it the spark of human genius that would eventually build the wonders of the ancient world? Or was it something darker? The discovery that humans will trade their freedom for the illusion of divine protection. The Black Land was a masterpiece of engineering, art, and philosophy, but its foundations were built on the absolute silencing of dissent. The monuments we admire today are the tombstones of 1,000 forgotten voices, drowned out by the roar of the pharaoh's praise. Those voices belong to the people who built the world, but were never allowed to own a piece of it. The transition from the Scorpion King to Narmer marks the moment history stopped being a collection of stories and became a directed narrative. It was the first time a human being successfully rewrote the rules of existence. By the time the Second Dynasty emerged, the concept of the pharaoh was so deeply embedded in the human psyche that it would take 3 millennia for the world to imagine a different way of living. The gods did not descend to Egypt. They were manufactured there, crafted out of the necessity for order and the human thirst for immortality. They were products of an era that valued the eternal collective over the temporary individual. We often search for the truth of Narmer in the dirt, hoping to find a skeleton or a definitive inscription. But the truth isn't in the physical remains. It's in the legacy of power that still haunts our modern structures. Every time we see a leader elevated to a status beyond reproach, every time a state demands total devotion at the expense of the individual, we are seeing a ghost of the First Dynasty. The Black Land was not just a place in North Africa, it was a blueprint for how to turn a man into a monument. It was the first successful experiment in total control, a laboratory where the limits of human obedience were tested and found to be almost infinite. The shadows of Abydos still have secrets to tell. Beneath the sands, there are likely more rows of silent servants, more tablets depicting the heavy hand of the king, and more evidence of the rituals that bridge the gap between the mundane and the divine. We are told that Egypt was a gift of the Nile, but that is only a half-truth. The Nile provided the water and the silt, but it was a cold, calculated ambition that turned that mud into an empire of the soul. The birth of the Black Land was not a peaceful sunrise. It was a calculated storm, a deliberate molding of human fear and hope into a shape that would last forever. It was a moment of profound transformation that required the world to forget its own past in order to embrace a gilded future. As the sun sets over the ruins of the Old Kingdom today, the silence is heavy. It is the same silence that Narmer commanded when he first donned the double crown. It is the silence of a world that has accepted its master. We may never know the man behind the mask, the human being who felt the heat of the sun and the cold of the desert night. That man was erased by the god he chose to become. In the end, Narmer's greatest achievement was not the unification of the land, but the successful deletion of his own humanity in exchange for an eternal stony gaze. He became the first human to realize that while flesh rots, an image can rule forever. The story of the First Dynasty is a reminder that civilization often begins with a choice: to live in the chaos of freedom or the shadow of a golden god. Narmer made that choice for his people, and the echoes of that decision vibrated through the centuries, building the pyramids, the temples of Karnak, and the Valley of the Kings. But as we walk through those magnificent ruins, we should remember the cost. We should remember the rows of graves at Abydos and the raised mace on the siltstone palette. The gods of Egypt did not bring peace. They brought a terrifying, beautiful order that required the world to bow. And once the world learned to bow, it never truly forgot how. The mystery of the Black Land remains, not because we lack information, but because we are afraid of what that information tells us about ourselves. It tells us that the line between a leader and a deity is a thin one, drawn in the sand by those who have the will to cross it. Narmer crossed it, and in doing so, he created a world where the sun never set on his authority. Whether that was a triumph of the human spirit or the beginning of a long, gilded nightmare is a question that each of us must answer for ourselves as we look into the unblinking eyes of the first Pharaoh. The dawn of the gods was not a beginning, but a transformation, a moment when one man realized that if you control the narrative of the afterlife, you own the lives of everyone in the present, and that perhaps is the darkest thriller